And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
Once upon a time, eggs were the simplest breakfast food, a symbol of stability, affordability, and domestic production. Today, they have become a sign of crisis, exposing cracks in the country's food security system. Amid loud promises to support American producers, millions of eggs are rotting in warehouses, while stores are filled with imports from Brazil and Turkey. How did this happen?
Economic force. Because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
It all started with politics. A new package of tariffs on imports from Mexico, Canada, and China was supposed to protect farmers. But the effect was the opposite. Major trading partners turned to Europe and South America, and the domestic market was flooded with goods that no one wanted to buy. While consumers in Ohio and Texas pay $5 a dozen, American farmers sell their eggs for 60 cents if they can find anyone to sell them to at all. Farms in Iowa and Pennsylvania are storing millions of dozen that no one is waiting for. Canada cancelled contracts to supply 170 million eggs, and this was a blow from which agriculture has never recovered. Tariffs, intended as protection, have become a noose. Instead of growth, there is stagnation. Instead of confidence, there is growing anxiety.
They don't allow our banks, and you know that Canada does not allow banks to go in.
But this crisis is not just a story about prices and logistics. It is a story about trust. Partners who have been buying American products for decades no longer believe in the stability of their supply. Consumers, accustomed to seeing products from local farms on the shelves, are now asking, why are we eating imports while our own farms are closing down? And farmers, the descendants of those who once fed the entire country, are faced with a choice: give up or go bankrupt for good. The paradox is becoming increasingly apparent. On the one hand, there are surpluses that have to be thrown away. On the other, supermarket shelves with price tags that force people to give up even the simplest meals. According to the Department of Agriculture, dozens of family farms have disappeared from the US map in recent months alone. Cold storage facilities are overflowing, transport is at a standstill, and millions of dollars are frozen in goods that no one is buying. And all this against the backdrop of loud statements about the restoration of national production and price control. The White House talks about temporary difficulties, but farmers see these difficulties turning into a systemic collapse. A country that has supplied the world with food for decades is losing not just exports, it is losing its self-confidence.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
When Canadian buyers turn to Brazilian suppliers and American eggs remain in refrigerators, it becomes clear that this is no longer about a single commodity. It is a symptom that the huge machine called American agriculture is breaking down. And today the question sounds different. If America can't even protect its eggs, what will it be able to protect tomorrow? This is not a story about breakfast. This is a story about a country that, for the first time in decades, risks losing control of its own food supply. The spring of 2025 went down in history as the beginning of the strangest food crisis of the decade. It all started with seemingly routine decisions, economic measures that were supposed to protect domestic producers. President Donald Trump signed a series of tariffs on imports from Mexico, Canada, and China. The goal was simple and sounded patriotic: bring manufacturing back home, give farmers an incentive, and force global partners to play by the rules. But behind these loud promises lay an avalanche of consequences that soon hit the entire industry.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Within weeks of the decrees being signed, food prices, especially for eggs, began to change rapidly. At first glance, the price increase seemed logical. Supplies became more expensive and imports declined. However, everything turned out to be more complicated. By May 2025, supermarkets in Texas and Ohio were charging nearly $5 for a dozen eggs, a figure that seemed impossible just a year ago. Shoppers stood frozen in front of the shelves, counting their money and putting back the products they usually bought. In some cities, private initiatives emerged. People banded together to keep chickens at home, making breakfast from your own backyard the new norm. Hundreds of videos on the internet taught people how to build a chicken coop, and not depend on stores. But the real drama was unfolding not in supermarkets, but in warehouses across the country. While stores were receiving products packaged in Turkey and labeled product of Brazil, millions of American eggs were sitting in warehouses, unclaimed, losing their shelf life. It seemed like a paradox. Tariffs designed to support farmers were actually cutting them off from their market. The protectionist policy, which on paper was supposed to protect American products, actually stifled them.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Canada, traditionally one of the largest buyers of American eggs, unexpectedly cancelled a huge contract, over 170 million dozen, for farmers in Iowa, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. This was a disaster. Mountains of products that could no longer be sold piled up in their warehouses. Some farmers said they even stored eggs in refrigerated trailers parked right in the fields because all the storage facilities were full. Several companies were forced to destroy entire batches to make room for new deliveries. There was a sense of loss in the air, not only economic, but also moral. The government tried to reassure the public. The Ministry of Agriculture published reports claiming that the situation is under control and that the surplus production is a temporary phenomenon caused by a transition period. However, farmers who watched their products spoil knew that there would be no transition. 3 months after the tariffs were introduced, domestic sales fell by almost 15% and exports by 38%.
So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
Many analysts link this collapse to a chain of events that had begun even earlier. In the spring of 2024, an outbreak of avian influenza forced the destruction of more than 38 million chickens. Production declined sharply, prices rose, and demand remained high. When the tariffs took effect, producers were faced with an oversupply. Poultry farms had restored their flocks, but foreign markets had already switched to other suppliers. Brazilian and Spanish companies filled the vacant niches, offering lower prices and stable supplies.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Against the backdrop of these changes, real trade chaos ensued within the US. Some experts argued that the egg situation was just the first crack in the system. After all, the tariffs affected not only food but also packaging, feed, and transportation components. All of this increased the cost of production. One Indiana manufacturer said in an interview that the price of feed had risen by almost 40% due to tariffs on imported grain additives from Canada. He could not compete with foreign companies that purchased the same ingredients without tax pressure. Meanwhile, the media picked up on the topic, turning it into a political storm. News channels aired reports about America's rotting farms. Cameras showed footage of overflowing storage facilities where thousands of dozen eggs lay untouched. Commentators spoke of an invisible disaster unfolding not on Wall Street, but in rural areas. But even more shocking was the next stage, the international reaction. After Canada's decision to refuse American supplies, other partners took similar steps. Japan and Singapore began to redistribute their purchases between suppliers from Europe and South America. Even Mexico, once the largest consumer of American agricultural products, reduced its egg imports by a third. In fact, in 6 months, the US lost its status as the global guarantor of food stability, a status that had been built up over decades. Domestically, the situation was also deteriorating. In some states, such as Iowa, excess stocks reached record levels. According to estimates by the independent research center AgriData, in May 2025, more than 60 million dozen unclaimed eggs were stored in the country. This is more than the average monthly sales volume for the entire Walmart chain. Cold storage facilities designed for short-term storage were turned into long-term storage facilities that consumed enormous amounts of energy. According to unofficial data, several large logistics operators received compensation from the federal budget for maintaining food security, although in reality it was for storing stale goods.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
In small towns where farms were the backbone of the local economy, bankruptcies began. Farming families that had existed for decades could not withstand several months of losses. Auctions began to appear advertising the sale of equipment, land, and machinery. In some areas of Pennsylvania, farmhouses were listed for sale at the price of a used car. People said they had never seen so many for sale signs on gates. And all this was happening against a backdrop of political controversy. Some blamed international competitors for the crisis, others blamed ineffective management and excessive protectionism. In Washington, there were statements about the need to adjust course, but no concrete decisions were made. Meanwhile, public discontent was growing. Users posted photos on social media. On one shelf, eggs from Brazil for $4.99, and next to them, news that farmers in a neighboring county were destroying their surplus. These images went viral, becoming a symbol of the absurdity of the situation. Some economists noted that the egg crisis was a unique example of how politics and economics can clash head-on. Protecting domestic producers turned into isolation. A system designed for export suddenly found itself without an external market. When that market disappeared, it turned out that domestic demand was too small to absorb the excess production.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
By midsummer, farmers began to band together, creating temporary cooperatives to sell at least some of their products directly to consumers. Initiatives such as Buy From Your Farmer appeared across the country, but they could not cover even a small part of the losses. Large supermarket chains, bound by contracts with foreign suppliers, were in no hurry to change their policies. Imported eggs sold steadily, while American shipments had more problems with certification, shelf life, and logistics. Economists at the University of Minnesota released a report warning that the egg situation is just the beginning of a chain reaction. According to their forecasts, if tariff policy does not change, similar crises could affect meat, dairy products, and corn. These predictions have already come true in part. By the end of the second quarter of 2025, corn exports had fallen by 22%, and dry milk supplies by almost a third. Within the country, people increasingly ask themselves a simple question: how did a country that had been considered a model of food stability for decades find itself in a situation where the shelves were full of imports and its own farms were closing down? There were no answers. The government cited temporary market fluctuations, while analysts pointed to a systemic policy error. But for those who lived in rural areas, things looked different. It was not a failure, it was a loss of confidence that the work of generations had meaning.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Thus began a crisis that at first seemed to be a local problem for farmers, but soon became a reflection of a deeper disease in the American economy, a disease of trust, inconsistency, and the illusion of control. And while Washington argued about who was to blame, thousands of eggs continued to rot in refrigerators, reminding us that sometimes the system collapses not because of enemies, but because of its own decisions. When it became clear in early summer 2025 that the egg surplus was not a temporary glitch, but a systemic crisis, the attention of experts and the media shifted from foreign trade to domestic problems. It was then that the real reasons for the collapse became apparent. A combination of the effects of bird flu, tariff policy, and a broken logistics network. Formally, it looked like a chain of coincidences, but in reality, it was a perfect storm created by their own hands.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
After millions of chickens were destroyed due to the virus, farmers invested everything they had to restore production. The state promised support, but in fact, most of the funds went to compensate large corporations, rather than small and medium-sized farms. Small farms took out loans to buy young stock, purchase feed, and upgrade equipment. When the tariffs came into effect, these farmers found themselves trapped. Domestic markets were oversaturated. exports had fallen, and loans had to be repaid. And that's when the real collapse began. Tariffs, originally conceived as a protective measure, led to a cascade of retaliatory measures. Several Asian countries, unwilling to depend on unstable American supplies, introduced temporary restrictions on imports from the US under the pretext of sanitary precautions. Formally, these were inspections, but in reality, they were a way to avoid an unpredictable partner. Containers of eggs that could not pass export certification began to pile up in American port warehouses. According to estimates by researchers at the University of Wisconsin, more than 12% of all products during this period were in limbo. They could neither be sold nor disposed of without incurring losses.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Then came the second wave of the crisis logistics. Overflowing warehouses in the central states needed transportation, but transport companies raised their rates by almost a third. This was explained by rising fuel prices, problems with licensing new carriers, and the fact that some freight routes were overloaded with imports. Railroads that had previously transported agricultural products now served containers with goods from Europe and Asia, which suddenly became more profitable than American ones. At the farm level, the situation looked even more dramatic. Where forklifts had once rumbled and packaging machines had once hummed, there was now silence. In cold storage rooms, rows of boxes of produce with expiring shelf lives stretched out. Employees left, and production lines stopped. Some farmers decided to simply turn off their refrigerators to reduce electricity costs, even though they knew this would mean losing all their goods. For them, it was a choice between the immediate death of their business and slow ruin.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
As the situation worsened, not only farms but also processing plants began to close. Factories producing powdered egg whites, instant foods, sauces, and confectionery mixes faced a shortage of storage capacity and transportation disruptions. Employees were put on part-time work, then furloughed. By the fall, unemployment in the agricultural sector had risen by almost 9% in 4 states, and that was just the official figure. Local administrations tried to intervene. In Iowa and Ohio, temporary strategic purchasing programs were created, whereby some of the eggs were bought up for food banks and schools. However, the scale of the crisis was too great. Even the federal purchasing program covered no more than 3% of the surplus. The Department of Agriculture published statistics showing that warehouses were filled to 280% of normal capacity. According to unofficial estimates, over 200 million eggs were destroyed in July alone, a figure comparable to the monthly consumption of an entire state.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Meanwhile, prices on the shelves continued to behave paradoxically. In large supermarket chains such as Walmart and Kroger, the cost of a dozen ranged from $3.80 to $5.20, even though farmers were already selling their goods at almost cost price. The difference was not due to greed, but to a complete collapse of the distribution system. Due to delays at warehouses and transport hubs, eggs from one end of the country did not make it to the other, as a result of which regions with a surplus of production could not supply regions with a shortage.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
For consumers, it seemed like a mockery. News feeds were full of stories about farms destroying their products, while shoppers complained that they couldn't find affordable products in their stores. A study conducted by Purdue University showed that more than 60% of Midwesterners do not understand why prices continue to rise despite a surplus of goods. This information gap became not just an economic factor, but an emotional one. People felt that they were being manipulated. Political scientists noted that the egg crisis reflected the gap between federal rhetoric and reality on the ground. While Washington spoke of temporary difficulties on the road to independence, farms employing entire families were closing in rural areas. Posters with slogans such as "Don't save us with words, buy our eggs" began to appear at rural fairs. Even without rallies and protests, the situation took on political significance. Gradually, the crisis began to affect related industries. Packaging manufacturers reported a 40% drop in orders, and logistics companies recorded contract cancellations. In some states, egg storage facilities began to be used as temporary warehouses for other perishable goods, semi-finished meat products, cheese, and even medicines requiring low temperatures. But this only exacerbated the chaos. The system designed for flexibility was overwhelmed.